The Kingdom of Kush, the Black Pharaohs who ruled the ancient world. They ruled Egypt, not as conquerors who tore things down, but as pharaohs who rebuilt what Egypt had forgotten, restoring the temples, reviving the old religious traditions, and governing from Memphis and Thebes as legitimate heirs of 3,000 years of civilization. They came from the south, from a kingdom the Egyptians had once called Kush and the Greeks called Ethiopia. Their pyramids still stand in the Sudanese desert, more pyramids than exist in all of Egypt, and almost no one knows who they were. Why did history forget the Black Pharaohs? What did they build in the centuries before and after Egypt? And what does the script they created, still undeciphered today, tell us about what we are still missing? South of Egypt, where the Nile pushes through a landscape of granite cataracts and golden sandstone cliffs, lies a land that the ancient Egyptians called Tarseti, the land of the bow. The name was not arbitrary. The people who lived in this stretch of the Nile Valley, from the first cataract at Aswan southward through what is now northern Sudan, were among the most skilled archers in the ancient world, and the bow, the weapon of the hunter and the warrior, was the symbol through which the Egyptians recognized and named them. We know this land as Nubia, and the civilization that grew from it was one of the longest-lasting and most sophisticated in all of ancient Africa. The Nile Valley of Nubia was not the same river landscape as the Nile of Egypt. Where the Egyptian Nile flowed through a broad, flat floodplain, the predictable annual inundation that made Egyptian agriculture so productive and Egyptian civilization so stable, the Nubian Nile was a more constrained, more energetic river, interrupted by 6 cataracts where granite outcroppings forced the water into rapids that made navigation difficult and provided natural barriers between the various regions of the valley. The landscape between the cataracts, broader stretches of floodplain where agriculture was possible, where the river slowed and could be navigated, were the natural locations for settlement, and it was in these stretches that the successive cultures of Nubian civilization developed. The earliest human occupation of the Nubian Nile Valley dates to the Paleolithic period, when hunter-gatherer communities followed the seasonal movements of game through the valley and the adjacent savanna. By the Neolithic period, roughly 5,000 to 3,000 BCE, permanent agricultural communities had established themselves along the Nubian Nile, cultivating sorghum and millet in the floodplain soils, herding cattle on the adjacent grasslands, and developing the craft traditions in pottery and worked stone that are the archaeological markers of settled agricultural life. These Neolithic communities were not the ancestors of all subsequent Nubian civilization in a simple genealogical sense. Populations moved, mixed, and were replaced over the millennia, but they established the basic ecological and agricultural framework within which all subsequent Nubian cultures would operate. The relationship between Nubia and Egypt goes back to the very beginning of Egyptian civilization, and it was never a simple relationship of dominance and subordination. From the earliest periods of Egyptian history, the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, roughly 4,000 to 2,700 BCE, Egypt and Nubia were connected by trade. Gold, ivory, ebony, cattle, and the exotic animals of sub-Saharan Africa moved northward along the Nile toward the Egyptian court. Grain, oil, wine, and manufactured luxury goods moved southward. This trade was mutually beneficial, and the wealthier and more politically organized it made both parties, the more it became a source of competition as well as cooperation. The gold of the eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea, accessible from the Nubian Nile through the wadis that cut through the desert plateau, was the commodity that most powerfully shaped the relationship between Egypt and Nubia. Gold was the metal of divine power in Egyptian culture, the substance from which the bodies of the gods were made, the material that expressed divine authority in every physical form, from royal statuary to temple decoration. Egypt's demand for gold was essentially unlimited, and the eastern desert of Nubia was among the richest, gold-producing regions accessible to the ancient world. Control of access to those gold deposits was a primary objective of Egyptian policy toward Nubia for over 2,000 years. And much of what the Nubians built, their states, their armies, their diplomatic relationships, was shaped by the need to manage this persistent Egyptian interest. The sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, a dramatically isolated flat-topped sandstone mesa rising from the west bank of the Nile near the Fourth Cataract in what is now northern Sudan, was one of the most important sacred sites in both Nubian and Egyptian religious traditions. The Egyptians, who established a major military and administrative center nearby at Napata during the period of their Nubian Empire, identified Jebel Barkal as the residence of the god Amun in his southernmost manifestation, a place where the divine presence was particularly concentrated and the communication between the human and divine worlds was particularly direct. This identification gave Jebel Barkal a religious significance that would outlast the Egyptian empire in Nubia by centuries, and the rulers of the later Kingdom of Kush at Napata would draw on the mountain's religious authority as a source of political legitimacy. The city of Kerma, situated near the Third Cataract of the Nile in what is now northern Sudan, was one of the most remarkable urban achievements in the ancient world, and its significance has been underappreciated in the historical literature that has focused attention on the more visible civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Near East. At its peak, between approximately 1750 and 1500 BCE, Kerma was a substantial urban center of perhaps 10,000 or more inhabitants, the capital of a kingdom that controlled the Nile Valley from the First Cataract to the Sixth, and that maintained diplomatic and commercial relationships with Egypt, the Near East, and the civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa simultaneously. The Defufa, the massive mud brick structures that are the most visible surviving monuments of the Kerma culture, are unlike anything else in the ancient world. The Western Defufa, the larger of the two surviving examples, is a solid mud brick structure approximately 20 meters high, with a footprint of roughly 25 by 45 meters, a huge, featureless block of unbaked brick that rises from the desert plain around it with an authority that comes from sheer mass rather than architectural elaboration. The function of the Defufa is not entirely clear from the archaeological evidence, but its association with the religious precinct of the city and the evidence for burning on its summit suggests that it served as a ceremonial platform for religious activities, a high place from which rituals could be conducted in sight of the community below and in proximity to the sky gods, whose favor the Kerma kings sought. The cemetery of Kerma, which has been systematically excavated since the late 19th century, and which represents one of the richest concentrations of prehistoric African burial evidence ever discovered, reveals a society of significant wealth inequality and complex social organization. The royal burials of the Kerma culture are extraordinary. Large circular tumuli of earth and stone covering burial chambers in which the deceased king was placed alongside elaborate grave goods, gold jewelry, bronze weapons, ceramic vessels, ivory objects, and in the most spectacular cases, alongside hundreds of sacrificed retainers who had been killed to accompany the king into the afterlife. The evidence of human sacrifice in the royal burials at Kerma is not in dispute archaeologically. The sacrificed individuals show signs of rapid burial in awkward positions that are inconsistent with natural death. But its interpretation in the context of Kerma religious and political culture is more nuanced than the bare fact suggests. The scale of the sacrifice, hundreds of individuals in the largest burials, implies a level of royal authority over the lives of subjects that had no parallel in contemporary Egypt, and the willingness of those subjects to participate in their own sacrifice, or the inability of anyone to resist the royal command, speaks to a form of political and religious power that was genuinely different from the administrative monarchy of Egyptian civilization. The Kerma culture's commercial reach extended in multiple directions simultaneously. Northward, along the Nile, commercial contact with Egypt was continuous and productive. Egyptian-made luxury goods appear in Kerma contexts in significant quantities, traded for the gold, ivory, and cattle that Egypt wanted from Nubia. Southward and westward into the interior of Africa, Kerma maintained connections with the agricultural and pastoral communities of the savannah that provided the exotic animals, giraffes, monkeys, cheetahs, that made such impressive gifts for Egyptian pharaohs and Eastern Mediterranean rulers. The geographic position of Kerma, at the junction of the Nile corridor and the westward savannah routes, made it a natural hub for this continental trade, and its rulers exploited this position to accumulate the wealth that built the city's monuments and filled its royal tombs. The relationship between Kerma and Egypt during the period of Kerma's greatest power, coinciding with the Second Intermediate Period in Egypt, when the Hyksos rulers from the Near East had taken control of northern Egypt, was a complex mixture of competition, cooperation, and occasional alliance. The Kerma kings reportedly maintained diplomatic contact with the Hyksos rulers in northern Egypt, a relationship of mutual convenience against the Egyptian dynasties of the south, who sought to reassert control over both the Nile Delta and the Nubian trade routes. When the Theban dynasty eventually expelled the Hyksos and reunified Egypt under the new kingdom, they also turned south against Kerma, and the Egyptian military campaigns of the early 18th dynasty systematically broke Kerma's power and established direct Egyptian control over the Nubian Nile Valley. The religious tradition of the Kingdom of Kush was one of the most syncretic and evolving in the ancient world, a tradition that began with indigenous African religious practices, absorbed the Egyptian divine system during the centuries of Egyptian domination, combined both traditions into a distinctive synthesis, and then added its own innovations that created religious forms found nowhere else in the ancient world. Understanding Kushite religion requires understanding not just the specific deities and rituals, but the broader relationship between religious authority and political power that gave Kushite religion its distinctive character. Amun, the great Egyptian god of hidden power, usually depicted as a man with a ram's head or wearing a double-plumed crown, whose cult center at Karnak in Upper Egypt was the wealthiest and most powerful religious institution in the ancient world, became the supreme deity of the Kingdom of Kush in a way that was both derived from Egyptian influence and genuinely Kushite in its character. The Kushites' identification with Amun was not simply an adoption of a foreign religion. They appear to have genuinely believed themselves to be the most faithful custodians of Amun's worship, more authentic in their devotion to the god than the Egyptians who had originally developed his cult. When the Kushite king Pi conquered Egypt in the 8th century BCE, his primary stated motivation was religious: the restoration of Amun's proper worship in a land that had become religiously corrupt under the rule of fragmented local princes. The Amun who was worshipped at Jebel Barkal, the sacred mountain near Napata, was understood to be the original, primordial Amun, the divine presence from whom all other manifestations of the god derived. This theological position gave the Kushite Amun a primacy over the Egyptian Amun that the Kushite kings exploited in their claim to legitimate authority over both kingdoms. The divine legitimacy of Kushite rule was not borrowed from Egypt, but derived from the Kushite kingdom's possession of Amun's southernmost and oldest sanctuary, a theological argument that placed Kush at the center of the divine order, rather than at its periphery. Apedemak, the lion god, whose temples have been found at multiple sites in the Meroitic kingdom, and whose distinctive iconography shows a male figure with a lion's head, is the deity that most clearly distinguishes Kushite religion from Egyptian religion. Apedemak had no Egyptian equivalent. He was a specifically African deity, a warrior god of the desert and the savanna, whose lion symbolism expressed a form of divine power that was rooted in the African landscape rather than in the Egyptian Nile Valley tradition. The temples built for Apedemak at sites like Musawarat es-Sufra and Naka, with their distinctive carved reliefs showing the god receiving royal offerings and their architectural forms that blend Egyptian structural conventions with African decorative elements, are among the most impressive and most distinctively Kushite religious monuments in the archaeological record. The double uraeus, the two rearing cobras that appear on Kushite royal crowns and headdresses, in contrast to the single cobra that decorated Egyptian royal crowns, is one of the most visible markers of Kushite royal ideology, and its symbolism is revealing. A single cobra on an Egyptian crown expressed the divine protection of the ruler by the cobra goddess Wadjet, the protector of Lower Egypt. Two cobras on a Kushite crown expressed the dual nature of Kushite royal authority. The king who ruled both Kush and Egypt, whose dominion extended over the united two lands that the pharaonic tradition represented as the great symbolic achievement of Egyptian kingship. The Kushite kings who wore the double uraeus were asserting in visual terms the legitimacy of their claim to rule the entire Nile Valley. The funerary tradition of the Kingdom of Kush underwent a remarkable evolution, from the elaborate tumulus burials of the Kerma culture to the pyramid burials of the later Napata and Meroitic periods. This evolution was not simply an adoption of the Egyptian pyramid form, but a creative transformation of it. The Kushite pyramids, which are steeper and more pointed than their Egyptian counterparts, typically rising at angles of 65 to 70 degrees, rather than the 52 degrees characteristic of the great Egyptian pyramids, have a visual character that is distinctively Kushite rather than simply derivative. They are smaller than the great Egyptian pyramids, but they are more numerous. The cemeteries at Meroë, Nuri, and El Kuru contain well over 200 pyramids, more than exist in the entirety of Egypt, and the landscape of the Sudanese desert is marked by their distinctive silhouettes in a way that makes immediately visible the scale and duration of the Kushite royal tradition. The engineering achievements of the Kingdom of Kush, in architecture, in metallurgy, in water management, and in the agricultural systems that sustained the kingdom's population, represent a technological tradition of genuine sophistication that has been underappreciated in the historical literature, partly because the evidence has been less systematically studied than that of Egypt or the classical Mediterranean, and partly because the isolation of Sudan from the mainstream of Western academic attention meant that the archaeology of Kush develops later and more slowly than the archaeology of better-known civilizations. The Kushite pyramids at Meroë, the capital of the kingdom from approximately 270 BCE onward, are the most numerous and the most visually impressive surviving monuments of Kushite civilization. The cemetery areas known as the South, North, and West cemeteries of Meroë contain over 200 pyramids of varying sizes, dating from the 3rd century BCE to the 4th century CE, and representing over 5 centuries of continuous royal and elite burial in the pyramid form. The construction of these pyramids, using sandstone quarried from the local desert plateau and dressed to varying degrees of precision, was a sustained architectural enterprise that required organized labor, skilled stonemasons, and architectural planning capacity of a level that speaks to a sophisticated state organization. The associated mortuary chapels, small, temple-like structures built against the eastern face of each pyramid, were the sites of the funerary cult and the location of the most elaborate sculptural decoration in the Kushite pyramid cemeteries. The reliefs carved on the walls of these chapels show the deceased being conducted to the realm of the dead, offering scenes before the gods of the Kushite pantheon, and the royal and elite activities, hunting, warfare, feasting, that defined a person of high status in Kushite society. The iconographic program of these chapels combines Egyptian funerary conventions with specifically Kushite elements. The Meroitic script inscriptions that accompany some reliefs, the distinctly African physical types of the figures depicted, the appearance of Kushite deities, alongside their Egyptian counterparts, in a visual language that is unmistakably its own. The iron smelting industry of Meroë was one of the most significant technological enterprises in ancient Africa. The slag heaps that still surround the ruins of Meroë, enormous piles of the waste product of iron smelting, accumulated over centuries of continuous production, are among the most tangible evidence of the scale of Meroitic industrial activity. The charcoal required to smelt iron in sufficient quantity to produce the slag heaps of Meroë required access to significant forest resources, and the deforestation of the Meroitic hinterland that the iron industry drove was probably one of the environmental factors that contributed to the kingdom's eventual decline. But, at its peak, the Meroitic iron industry produced iron weapons, agricultural tools, and industrial implements in quantities that supported both the kingdom's military capacity and its agricultural productivity. The shadoof, the simple but effective water-lifting device that uses a counterweighted pole to raise water from a lower level to a higher one, was the primary technology through which the Kushite farmers managed the relationship between the Nile floodplain and the agricultural fields above it. The Nile's annual inundation deposited rich silt on the floodplain, but the higher fields above the flood level required artificial irrigation to be productive. The shadoof allowed farmers to lift water from the river or from irrigation channels into the higher fields, extending the agricultural territory available for cultivation beyond the natural flood zone. The combination of shadoof irrigation with the flood recession agriculture practiced on the silt-covered floodplain gave the Kushite agricultural system a flexibility and productivity that could support substantial urban populations. The temples of the Kushite kingdom, built at sites stretching from Napata in the north to Naka and Musawarat-es-Sufra in the Butana Plateau south of Meroë, demonstrate architectural ambition and technical capability that would be impressive in any ancient context. The temple complex at Musawarat-es-Sufra is the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa, encompassing a series of interconnected courtyards, temples, and ancillary buildings spread over a large area and linked by a system of ramps and corridors whose function is not entirely understood. The presence of large animal enclosures at Musawarat, including what appear to be holding pens for elephants, has led some scholars to interpret the complex as a center for the capture and training of elephants for military use, a function that would connect the religious and practical dimensions of Kushite state organization in a characteristically integrated way. The geographic position of the Kingdom of Kush, straddling the Nile Valley at the junction of routes connecting sub-Saharan Africa, the Red Sea coast, and the Mediterranean world, gave it a commercial significance that extended far beyond its military or political power at any given moment. The Kushite kingdom was the intermediary through which the most valuable products of sub-Saharan Africa reached the Mediterranean world, and the revenues generated by this intermediary function sustained the kingdom's elaborate religious and architectural programs for over a millennium. Gold was the commodity that most consistently defined the economic relationship between Kush and the outside world. The eastern desert between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea coast contained some of the richest gold deposits in the ancient world, and the Kingdom of Kush controlled access to these deposits through its military presence in the eastern desert and its administrative management of the labor force that extracted the gold. Egyptian pharaohs had coveted this gold for 3,000 years, and the inscriptions of New Kingdom pharaohs who campaigned in Nubia are filled with lists of gold tribute exacted from the Nubian population. When the Kushite kingdom asserted its independence from Egypt and eventually reversed the power relationship by conquering Egypt itself, control of the gold deposits remained a central economic objective of the state. Ivory, the tusks of the African elephants that still inhabited the savannas south and west of the Kushite heartland in the ancient period, was the luxury material most closely associated with Kush in the perception of the Mediterranean world. Ivory was an essential material for the luxury crafts of every Mediterranean civilization. Carved furniture, statuary, gaming pieces, combs, handles for bronze mirrors, inlay for wooden objects. The demand was enormous, and the supply was concentrated in Africa, and the Kushite kingdom's position as the primary channel through which African ivory reached Mediterranean markets gave it a commercial leverage that it maintained for centuries. The exotic animals of sub-Saharan Africa, giraffes, lions, cheetahs, monkeys, ostriches, were high-value diplomatic gifts that the Kushite kings dispatched to foreign courts as demonstrations of their access to the wonders of the interior. The transportation of live giraffes down the Nile to Egypt, a journey of weeks in which the delicate animals had to be kept alive and healthy, was a logistical challenge that the Kushite kingdom apparently managed with regularity. Egyptian tomb paintings document the arrival of these Nubian tribute animals at the Egyptian court, and the giraffe became one of the iconic images of Egyptian-Nubian commercial relations. The Red Sea trade that developed from the Ptolemaic period onward, the commercial system connecting Egypt and the East African coast to the ports of Arabia, India, and beyond, was another commercial network in which the Kushite kingdom played a significant role. The Kushite port of Adulis on the Red Sea coast, which is actually in the territory that would become the Aksumite kingdom, suggesting complex territorial relationships, was one of the primary termini of the Red Sea trade, and the goods that moved through Kushite territory to reach the Red Sea coast included not just the traditional luxury commodities of ivory and gold, but the agricultural products of the Butana Plateau and the industrial output of the Meroitic iron industry. The commercial infrastructure that sustained this trade, the caravan routes, the way stations, the storage facilities, the merchant communities in the major cities, represented a significant investment of state resources and organizational capacity. The Kushite kings who managed this commercial system were not simply passive beneficiaries of their geographic position, but active organizers of the trade that made their kingdom prosperous, and the administrative sophistication required to manage a commercial network of this scale was one of the important dimensions of Kushite state capacity that the archaeological evidence increasingly reveals. One of the most distinctive and most historically significant features of the Kingdom of Kush was the role that women, specifically the Queen Mother, designated by the Meroitic title Kandake, from which the name Candace derives, played in the kingdom's political life. In a world where female political authority was generally exceptional and often temporary, the Kandake of Kush occupied an institutionalized position of political power that was recognized by the kingdom's subjects, by foreign powers, and by the religious institutions that legitimized royal authority.
The Kandake was not merely a royal consort or a regent for a minor king. She was a political actor in her own right, capable of making independent political decisions, commanding military forces, and representing the kingdom in diplomatic contexts. The origins of the Kandake institution are not entirely clear, but it appears to have developed from the broader Kushite cultural tradition of according women significant social and religious authority, a tradition that contrasts sharply with the increasingly patriarchal character of the contemporary Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations with which Kush interacted. The matrilineal elements in Kushite royal succession, the tracking of descent through the female line in ways that gave the Queen Mother a structural importance in determining legitimate royal succession, probably contributed to the political importance of the Kandake, whose role in managing succession questions gave her a form of political power that was institutionally grounded rather than simply personally achieved. The succession system of the Kushite kingdom was unusual by ancient Near Eastern standards, in ways that reflect this broader cultural emphasis on female authority. The Kushite throne did not pass automatically from father to son. The succession was more complex, involving
the selection of the new king from among the eligible male members of the royal family by a council of priests and senior officials. The Queen Mother, the Kandake, played a central role in this selection process, and her influence over the choice of the new king gave her a structural position in the political system that survived the reign of any individual king. A Queen Mother who had successfully guided the selection of her preferred candidate had a relationship with the new king that gave her ongoing influence over his decisions. The administrative system through which the Kushite kingdom was governed combined the personal authority of the king and the Kandake with a structured hierarchy of provincial governors, religious officials, and military commanders. The major cities of the kingdom, Napata, Meroë, and the provincial centers, were each governed by officials appointed by the royal court, and the communications between these centers and the capital were maintained by a system of royal messengers whose speed and reliability were essential to the functioning of an extended territorial state. The legal system of the Kingdom of Kush is one of the dimensions of Kushite civilization most difficult to recover, because the legal records that might illuminate it were written in the Meroitic script that remains only partially understood. What can be inferred from the archaeological evidence and from references in foreign sources suggests a system in which royal authority was the ultimate source of legal decision-making, with religious institutions playing a significant role in the interpretation and application of law. The priests of Amun at Napata, in particular, appear to have held a judicial authority that extended beyond purely religious matters into the broader domain of social regulation. A concentration of religious and legal authority in the same institution that gave the Amun priesthood a political influence that sometimes competed with royal power. The diplomatic relationships maintained by the Kushite kingdom with Egypt, with the Ptolemaic and Roman empires, and with the kingdoms of the Red Sea region were conducted by an administrative apparatus that included trained diplomats, translators, and the intelligence infrastructure needed to understand the political situations of the kingdoms with which Kush interacted. The Kushite ambassadors who traveled to Rome in the early 1st century CE, recorded in the Roman sources as exotic visitors from the extreme south, were representatives of a kingdom that understood the new power dynamic of the Mediterranean world and was actively managing its relationship with Rome to preserve Kushite commercial and political interests. The story of the Kushite conquest of Egypt, one of the most remarkable reversals of power in the ancient world, begins with a man named Pi, the ruler of the Kingdom of Kush at Napata, who looked northward in the 740s BCE and saw a fragmented, politically chaotic Egypt that had abandoned the religious standards of the pharaonic tradition. What he did in response was not merely military conquest, but a genuine act of religious restoration.
an assertion that the true guardians of Egyptian civilization were not the competing princelings who were squabbling over the Nile Delta, but the Kingdom of the South, which had maintained the worship of Amun in its pure form at Jebel Barkal, while Egypt had descended into religious and political disorder. Pi's campaign of conquest, recorded in detail on a granite stele that was found at Napata in the 19th century and is now in the Cairo Museum, is one of the most complete accounts of ancient Egyptian military history that survives. The stele, inscribed in classical Egyptian hieroglyphics, demonstrating the Kushite ruler's mastery of the Egyptian literary tradition, describes Pi's reaction to reports of disorder in Egypt, his decision to march northward, his military campaigns against the various local rulers of Egypt, his religious activities at each major cult center, bathing in the sacred lake, presenting offerings to the god, purifying the temples that had been defiled by the presence of uncircumcised foreigners, and his eventual triumph over the assembled princelings of Egypt. The military force that Pi led northward was built around the famous archers of the Tar Seti tradition, the land of the bow warriors, whose skill with the composite bow had made Nubian archers the most sought-after military specialists in the ancient Near East for millennia. But it also included infantry and, most importantly, cavalry. The Kushite, horse-mounted warriors whose mobility and striking power gave the Kushite army an offensive capability that the foot soldier-based armies of the competing Egyptian factions could not match. The specific combination of archery and cavalry, the ability to strike from a distance and to pursue defeated enemies at speed, was the tactical expression of the Kushite military tradition, and it was devastatingly effective against the fragmented local forces of late-period Egypt. The 25th dynasty that Pi established, the dynasty of Kushite pharaohs who ruled Egypt from approximately 747 to 656 BCE, represented one of the most creative and most successful periods of Egyptian royal patronage in the late period of Egyptian civilization. The Kushite pharaohs were genuine believers in the Egyptian religious tradition, not merely conquerors who had adopted Egyptian royal titles for political purposes, and their commitment to the restoration of Egyptian religious life was expressed in an ambitious building program that constructed and restored temples from the Delta to the Fourth Cataract of Nubia. Taharqa, the greatest of the Kushite pharaohs, built on a scale that rivaled the great builders of the New Kingdom, and his construction projects at Karnak, at Kawa, and at sites throughout the Nile Valley were genuine additions to the artistic and architectural legacy of Egyptian civilization. The Kushite pharaohs also engaged actively in the international politics of the Near East, maintaining diplomatic relations with the Assyrian Empire and with the kingdoms of the Levant in ways that reflected Kushite Egypt's status as a major power. The biblical account of the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem in 701 BCE mentions the approach of an Egyptian army under a commander named Taharqa, generally identified with the future Kushite pharaoh Taharqa, as a factor in the diplomatic calculations of the period. Whether Taharqa's forces actually relieved Jerusalem, or whether the Assyrian withdrawal was caused by other factors, the episode places Kushite Egypt as an active player in the power politics of the Near East, in a way that demonstrates the genuine scale of Kushite international engagement. Of all the rulers of the 25th dynasty, Taharqa stands out as the most impressive in the breadth of his achievements and the scale of his ambitions. He ruled for over 25 years as pharaoh of a united Egypt and Kush, and during that time he left his mark on the Nile Valley from the Delta to the Fourth Cataract, in a building program that combined genuine architectural innovation with a commitment to the Egyptian religious tradition so thoroughgoing that it would have satisfied the most demanding standards of any previous pharaoh. The additions that Taharqa made to the great temple complex at Karnak, the religious heart of Egyptian civilization, where the Amun cult maintained its central sanctuary, included a colonnade of large papyrus columns, fragments of which still stand, and which demonstrate the architectural scale and ambition of his building program. At Kawa in Nubia, he built a complete new temple complex, whose walls were decorated with reliefs in the finest traditions of Egyptian temple art. At Sanam, near Napata, he built a treasury and a temple whose scale and quality of workmanship reflected the enormous resources that his unified kingdom commanded. And throughout the Egyptian Nile Valley, he restored temples that had fallen into disrepair during the preceding centuries of political fragmentation, endowing them with new revenues and new personnel to maintain the cult activities that Egyptian religious tradition required. The intellectual life of Taharka's court was remarkable by any ancient standard. The Kushite pharaohs brought with them from the south a tradition of Amun worship that had developed in relative isolation during the centuries of Egyptian weakness, and the encounter between this southern Amun tradition and the accumulated learning of the Egyptian temple establishments produced a creative theological dialogue whose products included some of the most sophisticated religious texts of the late period. Taharka himself is documented as a man of genuine learning. His interest in religious texts and his patronage of the scribal establishments that produced them reflect an intellectual engagement with the tradition he was ruling that went beyond the ceremonial requirements of kingship. The international recognition of Taharka's kingdom as a genuine great power was expressed in the diplomatic contacts that his reign maintained with the kingdoms of the Near East, the Mediterranean world, and the interior of Africa. The mention of Taharka in the Hebrew Bible, in the context of the Assyrian invasion of Judah during the reign of King Hezekiah, places him in the company of the major political actors of the 8th century Near East. His successors' confrontations with Assyrian imperial expansion would define the last chapter of Kushite rule in Egypt. But at the height of Taharka's reign, the combined kingdom of Egypt and Kush was a power that any ancient ruler had to take into account. The art produced during Taharka's reign, the royal sculpture, the temple reliefs, the minor arts of the court, combined Egyptian formal conventions with a Kushite physical type and aesthetic sensibility that created something distinctive within the broad tradition of Nilotic art. The royal portraits of Taharka show a figure who is recognizably a pharaoh in every conventional attribute of Egyptian royal representation. The crown, the uraeus, the scepters, the formal pose, but whose facial features reflect a physical type that is identifiably different from the Egyptian norm, the product of a royal family from further south along the Nile. These portraits are historically significant as representations of a genuinely African ruler in the role that Egyptian civilization had created for its pharaohs, and they complicate simplistic narratives about both Egyptian civilization and its relationship to sub-Saharan Africa. The confrontation between the Kingdom of Kush and the Roman Empire, which occurred in the decades following Rome's conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE, produced one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of Roman imperial expansion, and one of the most impressive displays of Kushite military capacity in the entire history of the kingdom. The central figure of this confrontation was the Kandake Amanirenas, a queen with one eye, who had lost the other in battle, and her resistance to Roman military pressure was so effective that Rome eventually concluded a peace treaty that gave Kush terms more favorable than the empire typically offered to peoples it had defeated in the field. The initial Kushite offensive, conducted around 24 BCE, while the Roman prefect of Egypt was away campaigning in Arabia, struck into the Roman-held territory of the First Cataract region, sacking the city of Syene, modern Aswan, and carrying off Roman statues, including a bronze head of the Emperor Augustus, that were deposited in Meroë as trophies of the raid. The bronze head of Augustus, found at Meroë in the 20th century and now in the British Museum, was buried beneath the threshold of a temple, so that everyone who entered the temple walked over the head of the Roman emperor. If the placement was deliberate, and it almost certainly was, it was a statement of political contempt that required considerable self-confidence in the face of Roman power. The Roman counter-campaign, conducted by the prefect Gaius Petronius, advanced into Kushite territory, sacking Napata and establishing a garrison at Casa Ibrim in Lower Nubia. The Kushite response, a series of military operations against the Roman garrison that kept the Roman forces under pressure while diplomatic negotiations proceeded, demonstrated the kingdom's ability to sustain military resistance against Roman forces in terrain that favored the defenders. The eventual peace settlement, concluded in 21 or 20 BCE, restored the border approximately to the pre-conflict position, freed the Kushite hostages held by Rome, and, most remarkably, waived the tribute that the Kushites had been expected to pay as a defeated power. Rome did not collect tribute from Kush. The scholar-king tradition of the Kushite kingdom, the rulers who were credited with intellectual achievements alongside their military and political ones, found its most lasting expression in the creation of the Meroitic script, a writing system developed in the 2nd or 3rd century BCE to write the Meroitic language. The Meroitic script, which consists of an alphabetic system of 23 signs adapted from Egyptian hieroglyphic and demotic writing, represented a significant intellectual achievement. The creation of a writing system specifically designed for a language that was not Egyptian, capable of representing the sounds of Meroitic in a way that the Egyptian writing system, which had been used for Meroitic administrative purposes before the script's development, could not adequately do. The Meroitic script is still not fully deciphered. The sign values, the phonetic sounds that each sign represents, have been worked out sufficiently well that Meroitic texts can be read aloud without difficulty. But the Meroitic language itself remains poorly understood because there is no bilingual text comparable to the Rosetta Stone that would allow the vocabulary and grammar to be reconstructed from scratch. The hundreds of Meroitic inscriptions known from monuments, stelae, and small objects across the former kingdom yield their phonetic content readily, but give up their semantic content only partially, and the full understanding of what the Meroitic inscriptions say, what kings and queens and priests and traders wrote about in the language of their own civilization, remains one of the great unsolved problems of ancient African history. The confrontation between the Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty and the Assyrian Empire, the great military power of the Near East in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, whose iron-equipped armies were the most effective military force in the ancient world at the time, was one of the defining conflicts of the late Bronze Age to early Iron Age transition, and its outcome shaped the subsequent history of both Egypt and Kush in fundamental ways. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon's invasion of Egypt in 671 BCE and his successor Ashurbanipal's subsequent campaigns were not merely military operations, but encounters between fundamentally different civilizational models. And the Kushite response to Assyrian pressure, the combination of military resistance and eventually strategic retreat, shaped the direction of Kushite civilization for the subsequent centuries. The Assyrian military advantage was primarily technological. The Assyrian army used iron weapons and iron armor extensively, giving it an edge in individual combat over the bronze-equipped Egyptian and Kushite forces. The Assyrian siege technology, the battering rams, the siege ramps, the catapults, was the most advanced in the ancient world, and the Assyrian ability to take fortified cities that could withstand less sophisticated attackers gave them an offensive capability that the Kushite pharaohs had difficulty countering. The Kushite response, military resistance, followed by strategic withdrawal, was a rational response to this technological reality, preserving the Kushite army and the Kushite state, rather than risking both in a decisive engagement against an opponent with systematic military advantages. The loss of Egypt was a genuine political and economic setback for the Kushite kingdom, but it was not an existential catastrophe. The Kushite heartland, the Nile Valley from the First Cataract southward, the Butana Plateau, and the eastern desert goldfields, remained under Kushite control, and the commercial networks that connected Kush to the African interior and to the Red Sea trade were not disrupted by the Assyrian campaigns in northern Egypt. The Kushite kings who retreated to Napata after the Assyrian conquest refocused their political and economic energies on the consolidation and development of the Kushite core territory, eventually shifting the capital to Meroë, further south and further from the Assyrian sphere of influence, and entering a period of renewed prosperity that would last for several centuries. The ideological response to the loss of Egypt was also significant. The Kushite royal tradition maintained the claim to pharaonic authority and the use of Egyptian royal titulary long after the practical ability to exercise authority in Egypt had been lost. And this continued assertion of pharaonic legitimacy kept alive the political and cultural identity that the 25th dynasty had established. The Kushite kings at Napata and later at Meroë continued to build Egyptian-style temples, to conduct Egyptian-style religious rituals, and to be buried under pyramids decorated with Egyptian funerary texts maintaining the forms of Egyptian civilization in the Kushite heartland as a statement about the kingdom's cultural inheritance and its continued claim to the pharaonic tradition. The political history of the Kushite kingdom in the centuries between the loss of Egypt and the transfer of the capital to Meroë is dominated by a remarkable institution, the Oracle of Amun at Napata, which exercised a power over royal succession that at times appeared to override the wishes of the living king. The priests of Amun at Napata maintained a tradition by which the god himself chose the next king, through an oracle in which the divine statue was carried in procession, and the god indicated his choice among the candidates by stopping in front of the chosen individual. This system gave the priestly establishment a structural role in the selection of the king that made the Amun priesthood one of the most powerful institutions in the Kushite state. The ancient sources, primarily the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE and drawing on earlier Greek accounts of Kush, describe an extraordinary episode in which the priests of Amun at Napata sent word to the reigning king that the god had commanded the king to kill himself, and the king complied. Whether or not this specific episode is historically accurate in its details, the underlying political reality it describes, a priestly establishment with sufficient institutional authority to constrain royal behavior, and royal acknowledgement of that authority, is consistent with what the broader evidence from Napatan political culture suggests. The transformation of this situation that Diodorus attributes to King Arkamani I, a ruler of the 3rd century BCE, who reportedly responded to the priestly command to die by marching to the temple with an armed force and killing the priests instead, thereby breaking the priestly monopoly on this form of political power, represents a significant shift in the balance between royal and religious authority in the Kushite state. Whether Arkamani's action was as dramatic and violent as Diodorus describes, or whether the change in the balance of power was more gradual, the coincidence of this narrative with the subsequent transfer of the capital to Meroë, further from the Amun priesthood at Napata, suggests a genuine political reconfiguration in which royal authority asserted itself against priestly power. The intelligence and security apparatus of the Kushite kingdom was required to manage threats from multiple directions simultaneously. The desert nomads who periodically raided the agricultural settlements of the Nile Valley and the Butana Plateau. The Egyptian and later the Ptolemaic power to the north, which maintained an interest in Nubian gold and in the stability of the Nile Valley trade routes. And the internal threats posed by ambitious nobles and regional commanders who might use their distance from the capital to assert greater autonomy than the central government was comfortable with. The management of this multi-directional security environment required both a military force capable of responding to threats across a wide geographic range and an intelligence system capable of identifying threats before they materialized. The caravan networks that connected the Kushite kingdom to its commercial partners in sub-Saharan Africa and the Arabian Peninsula were also intelligence networks. The merchants and traders who traveled these routes brought back information about political conditions, military movements, and commercial opportunities in the regions they visited. The Kushite court's knowledge of the political situation in distant regions, the kind of knowledge that informed its diplomatic and commercial strategies, was partly derived from the reports of these commercial travelers, whose professional activity gave them both the access to distant regions and the motivation to bring back useful information about what they had observed. The city of Meroë, which became the capital of the Kushite kingdom sometime around 270 BCE, and remained the center of Kushite civilization for over 5 centuries, was one of the most industrially active cities in the ancient world, and the comparison that some modern scholars have made between Meroë and Birmingham during the British Industrial Revolution, while obviously imprecise in its details, captures something real about the scale and character of Meroitic industrial production. The iron smelting industry that was centered at Meroë was the largest known iron-working enterprise in sub-Saharan Africa in the ancient period, and its output of iron weapons, agricultural tools, and industrial implements supported both the military capacity and the agricultural productivity of the kingdom over several centuries. The environmental consequences of the Meroitic iron industry were significant and ultimately damaging to the long-term sustainability of the kingdom. Smelting iron ore requires charcoal as the fuel for the furnaces, and charcoal requires the burning of wood in the absence of oxygen, a process that consumed vast quantities of timber from the forests and woodlands of the Butana Plateau and the adjacent savannas. The slag heaps that surround Meroë are not just evidence of industrial scale, they are also evidence of deforestation, because each ton of iron produced required many tons of charcoal, and each ton of charcoal required the felling and processing of a substantial area of woodland. The progressive deforestation of the Meroitic hinterland reduced the land's ability to retain moisture, accelerated erosion, and contributed to the aridification of the region, a positive feedback loop in which iron production required more deforestation, which produced more aridification, which reduced agricultural productivity, which increased the pressure to expand iron production to maintain military and economic capability. The climate change that affected the Sahel region in the early centuries of the Common Era, a shift toward drier, more unpredictable rainfall patterns that reduced the productivity of agriculture across the region, compounded the environmental damage caused by the iron industry. The Butana Plateau that had been productive savanna in the early Meroitic period became progressively more arid during the latter centuries of the kingdom, and the agricultural systems that had sustained the Meroitic population came under increasing stress. The decline in agricultural productivity reduced the tax revenues available to the central government, increased social tension between a taxed population and a state that demanded resources for its military and ceremonial programs, and weakened the economic foundations of the kingdom at precisely the time when new external challenges were emerging. The rise of the Aksumite kingdom in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea was the most significant external development affecting the Kushite kingdom in the later Meroitic period. Aksum, which developed rapidly as a commercial power from the 1st century CE onward, based on its control of the Red Sea trade and its agricultural productivity in the Ethiopian highlands, offered an alternative route for goods moving between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world that bypassed the Nile Valley corridor that had been the commercial highway of the Kushite kingdom for centuries. As Aksumite commercial power grew, the relative importance of the Kushite commercial network declined, and the revenues that the kingdom derived from its intermediary function in the African-Mediterranean trade diminished accordingly. The decline of the Kingdom of Kush in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE was a gradual process rather than a sudden collapse, a slow accumulation of internal and external pressures that progressively reduced the kingdom's military capacity, its economic resources, and its political coherence until the final Aksumite campaign of the 330s CE found a kingdom already so weakened that it could not mount an effective resistance. Understanding the character of this decline requires attention to the multiple reinforcing factors that were simultaneously eroding the kingdom's foundations. The fiscal crisis of the late Meroitic period was rooted in the same structural tensions that afflict many historical empires. The cost of maintaining the military and ceremonial apparatus of a major state, growing faster than the revenues available to pay for it. The tax demands imposed on the agricultural population of the Nile Valley became increasingly burdensome as agricultural productivity declined with the progressive aridification of the Butana Plateau and the degradation of the agricultural infrastructure through reduced maintenance investment. The gap between what the state needed and what the population
could provide created social tensions that expressed themselves in reduced cooperation with state demands, evasion of tax obligations, and, in the most extreme cases, active resistance to state authority. The political fragmentation that characterized the last century of the Kushite kingdom was both a cause and a consequence of the economic decline. As the central government's ability to project authority and distribute resources diminished, regional commanders and local elites had both the incentive and the increasing capacity to manage their own affairs without reference to the central court. The long distances between Meroë and the northern and southern extremities of the kingdom made central control difficult under the best of circumstances. And, as the administrative capacity of the state declined, the effective authority of the central government contracted progressively toward the core territory around the capital. The last clearly Meroitic rulers are documented by inscriptions that become progressively less frequent and less geographically widespread in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries CE. A pattern of inscription decline that tracks the contraction of effective royal authority and the reduction of resources available for the monument building and inscription carving that had been the media of royal self-expression throughout the kingdom's history. The absence of inscriptions from sites that had previously produced them regularly is as informative about the late Meroitic political situation as the presence of inscriptions had been about the kingdom's earlier vitality. The commercial shift toward the Red Sea routes, which had been gradually undermining the Kushite position as a commercial intermediary for over 2 centuries, accelerated in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries CE as Aksumite commercial and political power grew. The goods that had previously moved through Kushite territory to reach Mediterranean markets increasingly moved directly through Aksumite-controlled Red Sea ports, bypassing the Nile Valley route entirely. The loss of transit revenues and the reduction in commercial activity along the Nile corridor
further reduced the economic resources available to the Meroitic state and accelerated the downward spiral of fiscal pressure and reduced investment that characterized the late period. The final destruction of the Kingdom of Kush came from the south and east rather than from the north, from the Aksumite kingdom, whose commercial success had been eroding the economic foundations of Kushite power for generations. The Aksumite king Ezana, who ruled in the mid-4th century CE, and whose reign is documented by inscriptions in Ge'ez, South Arabian, and Greek that have survived on stone stelae, conducted a military campaign against the Noba peoples of the Nile Valley in the years around 330 CE that brought Aksumite forces into what had been the Kushite heartland, and that effectively ended organized resistance to Aksumite expansion in the region. Ezana's inscriptions describing his campaign, which are among the most detailed accounts of military operations in any ancient African context, portray the Aksumite forces moving through the Nile Valley, defeating various groups identified as Noba, burning settlements, capturing people and cattle, and establishing the supremacy of the Aksumite king over the territory he traversed. The language of the inscriptions frames the campaign in religious terms. Ezana, who was probably a recent convert to Christianity at the time of the campaign, describes his victories as gifts from his God. But the political and economic motivations are equally clear. Ezana was securing Aksumite control over the Nile Valley corridor and eliminating the remaining Kushite political structures that might compete with Aksumite commercial and political hegemony in the region. The physical destruction at Meroë, the burning of the royal palaces and administrative buildings that is documented archaeologically by destruction layers in the excavated ruins, marked the end of the city as a functioning royal capital. The pyramids that had been built over centuries around the cemetery areas were not demolished. They were simply abandoned, left to the encroachment of the desert sands that would progressively bury them over the subsequent centuries, until their rediscovery by European travelers and archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries.
The gradual disappearance of the monuments under drifting sand was a physical embodiment of the kingdom's disappearance from the historical memory of the outside world. The populations that had constituted the Kushite kingdom did not simply disappear with the political structures that had organized them. They continued to live along the Nile, to practice agriculture and pastoralism in the same landscape, and to maintain elements of the cultural traditions that the kingdom had developed. The religious practices associated with Amun and Apademak, the craft traditions of pottery and metalwork, and possibly elements of the Meroitic language, for some time after the political extinction of the state. The successor kingdoms that emerged in the Nubian Nile Valley in the post-Meroitic centuries, the Nubian Christian kingdoms of Nabatea, Makuria, and Alwa, which flourished from the 6th to the 14th centuries CE, incorporated elements of the older Kushite cultural tradition into their own distinctive syntheses of African, Christian, and Byzantine cultural influences. The Meroitic script, whose signs can be read phonetically, but whose language remains only partially understood, was the final casualty of the kingdom's fall. With the destruction of the administrative and religious institutions that had trained the scribes who used the script and that had provided the social context in which Meroitic literacy was meaningful, the script fell out of use within a generation or two of the kingdom's end. The inscriptions carved in Meroitic on the stele and temple walls of the former kingdom became unreadable to the people who lived among them, silent witnesses to a civilization that had developed its own means of self-expression and had taken the full understanding of that expression with it into silence. The Kingdom of Kush was forgotten by the wider world for roughly 1,500 years, remembered, if at all, only in the biblical references to Kush and Ethiopia, and in the scattered classical accounts of the Ethiopians and the Nubians,
that described a civilization at the edges of the known world. The rediscovery of the kingdom by European travelers and archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries was one of the most dramatic archaeological revelations of the modern era, fundamentally changing the understanding of ancient African history and forcing a reassessment of long-held assumptions about the distribution of civilization in the ancient world. The Scottish traveller James Bruce, who visited the ruins of Meroë in 1772, was among the first modern Europeans to describe the pyramids of the Kushite kingdom to a Western audience. The Italian explorer Giovanni Ferlini, who in 1834 dynamited the tops of several Meroitic pyramids in a brutal search for buried treasure, finding a remarkable collection of jewelry from a royal burial in one of the pyramids he destroyed, brought Meroitic artifacts to European attention in a way that combined genuine archaeological revelation with destructive methodology that has cast a shadow over his legacy. The systematic archaeological investigation of the Kushite sites began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with the work of scholars like Francis Llewellyn Griffith, who made the first significant progress in understanding the Meroitic script, and Charles Bonnet, whose recent excavations at Kerma have transformed the understanding of the early Kushite cultural tradition. The significance of the Kingdom of Kush for contemporary African cultural and political identity has been a matter of growing recognition and discussion since the mid-20th century. The existence of a powerful, sophisticated African civilization that had ruled Egypt, that had placed black African pharaohs on the throne of one of the world's greatest ancient civilizations, was a fact of considerable significance for African peoples seeking to assert the historical depth and sophistication of African civilization against the long tradition of Eurocentric historical narratives that had minimized or denied it. The Black Pharaohs of the 25th Dynasty, Piye, Shabaka, Taharqa, and their successors, were figures whose historical reality challenged simplistic narratives about the relationship between African peoples and ancient civilization. The UNESCO Archaeological Survey of Nubia, conducted in the 1960s in advance of
the construction of the Aswan High Dam, which would flood the lower Nubian Nile Valley under the waters of Lake Nasser, was one of the largest archaeological rescue operations ever conducted, employing teams from dozens of countries to record and excavate as much of the threatened heritage as possible before it disappeared beneath the rising waters. The salvage of the Abu Simbel temples, lifted block by block and reassembled on higher ground above the new lake, was the most dramatic single operation. But the broader survey documented thousands of archaeological sites and recovered an enormous body of evidence about Nubian history and culture that would otherwise have been lost permanently. The pyramids of Meroë, which the Sudanese government has been working to develop as a heritage tourism destination under the banner of Sudan's Nubian heritage, receive a fraction of the visitors that the Egyptian pyramids attract, despite being comparably impressive and far less crowded. The comparative neglect of the Sudanese archaeological heritage in global heritage tourism reflects a complex of factors: the political instability of Sudan in recent decades, the relative inaccessibility of the sites, and the broader global pattern of attention that has consistently privileged Egyptian and Mediterranean antiquities over the equally significant but less globally marketed civilizations of sub-Saharan Africa. The DNA analysis of ancient Kushite remains, still in early stages compared to the extensive genetic studies of Egyptian mummies, is beginning to provide biological evidence to complement the archaeological and textual record of the kingdom. The preliminary results suggest a population that showed genetic continuity with the modern peoples of Sudan and the Horn of Africa, with some admixture from Egyptian and Near Eastern populations, reflecting the commercial and political contacts that characterize the kingdom's history.
The descendants of the Kushite kingdom's population are the people of modern Sudan and northern Ethiopia, communities whose living cultural traditions, languages, and social practices carry traces of the ancient civilization that built the pyramids of the desert and placed its kings on the throne of the pharaohs. The Kingdom of Kush deserves its place alongside Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the other great civilizations of the ancient world, not as a peripheral or derivative civilization that borrowed its identity from its northern neighbor, but as an original, creative, and enduring civilization that made its own distinctive contributions to the human story. Its pyramids are more numerous than Egypt's. Its queens held more institutionalized power than queens in almost any other ancient civilization. Its iron industry fueled an industrial revolution in sub-Saharan Africa. Its kings ruled Egypt as legitimate pharaohs and held Rome to an honorable peace. And the script it created, still waiting for its Rosetta Stone, still holding its secrets in the desert sand, remains one of the great undeciphered puzzles of ancient history, a reminder that the full story of Kush has not yet been told. The warrior tradition of Kush extended beyond the famous archers to include a military culture that was sophisticated in its organization and remarkably effective in its deployment. The Kushite war elephant, captured from the savanna populations of sub-Saharan Africa and trained for military use, was a weapon system that the Kushite army deployed in ways that differed from the Ptolemaic and Seleucid use of Indian elephants. The African bush elephant, larger and more unpredictable than its Asian counterpart, required different training techniques and was used in different tactical roles, but it was no less terrifying to infantry who had never encountered it. And the Kushite armies, that included elephants alongside cavalry and archers, had a combined arms capability that made them formidable opponents across a wide range of tactical situations. The women of the Kushite elite, not just the Kandake, but the broader class of high-status women whose presence in the archaeological and textual record is striking by ancient standards, were participants in the public and ceremonial life of the kingdom in ways that went well beyond the domestic sphere. Temple reliefs show women making offerings to the gods alongside or in place of men. Funerary texts attribute religious authority, divine protection to deceased women as readily as to men. And the elaborate gold jewelry found in women's burials, the broad collar necklaces, the arm rings, the earrings, the crowns, speaks to women who occupied roles in public ceremonial life that required the visual demonstration of status and authority that jewelry provided. The agricultural calendar of the Kushite kingdom was organized around the Nile flood cycle in ways that differed significantly from the Egyptian agricultural calendar, because the Nile flood at the latitude of Meroë occurred at a different season and with different characteristics than the flood in Lower Egypt. The Kushite farmers who worked the agricultural land of the Butana Plateau and the Nile floodplain had developed over centuries a detailed empirical knowledge of their local flood patterns, soil types, and crop varieties that allowed them to maximize agricultural productivity in an environment that presented significant challenges. The agricultural manuals and technical texts that might have documented this knowledge were written in Meroitic and remain largely inaccessible due to the undeciphered state of the language. But the fact of the knowledge is demonstrated by the sustained agricultural productivity that supported the kingdom's population for over a millennium. The relationship between Kush and the Mediterranean world in the Hellenistic and Roman periods produced a fascinating cultural exchange that archaeology is only beginning to document fully. Kushite elites imported Mediterranean luxury goods, Hellenistic pottery, Roman glass, bronze vessels, and other manufactured objects that appear in elite burials and in the ruins of palatial buildings throughout the Meroitic kingdom. These goods were not merely passive imports, but active choices by Kushite consumers who found Mediterranean material culture appealing alongside their own artistic traditions. The selective adoption of Mediterranean goods, some types accepted enthusiastically, others apparently ignored, reveals a Kushite aristocracy that was engaged with the wider world while maintaining a clear sense of its own cultural priorities. The botanical and environmental evidence from Kushite archaeological sites, the charred seeds, the wood charcoal, the animal bones, and the landscape features preserved in the archaeological record, is beginning to reveal the ecological dimensions of Kushite civilization in ways that complement the architectural and artistic evidence. The evidence for the cultivation of sorghum, millet, and other African crops, alongside the wheat and barley of the Egyptian agricultural tradition, speaks to a mixed agricultural system that combined the inherited practices of sub-Saharan African farming with the techniques adopted from the Egyptian tradition. The evidence for cattle herding on the grasslands adjacent to the Nile Valley speaks to the pastoral dimension of Kushite food production that complemented the irrigated agriculture of the floodplain. And the evidence for the processing of wild plant foods, the grinding stones, the storage pits, the evidence of seasonal harvest activities, speaks to a food system that was more diverse and more resilient than a purely agricultural system would have been.